So, this lecture today is going to be on the subject of the hijab as part of our discussion of Islam in our world religions class. So, the first thing to know about the hijab is that it's usually translated as veil. And so we can talk about the tradition of the hijab or the tradition of the veil in Islam. However, the word does not refer to just one thing. So sometimes, and probably most of the time, people are referring to a specific head covering that women will wear, a headscarf that they will wear that covers their hair and their upper body. However, the hijab can also refer to other types of coverings in general. So it can refer to any of a number of head and body coverings that we'll look into a little in a little bit. Sometimes the word hijab refers to the rules for modesty in dress, both for men and for women. So sometimes it's a reference to the entire set of rules. And sometimes it was a reference to the curtain that divided men and women physically. And sometimes it would even refer to the separation, the veil that exists between God and human beings. So the word hijab does have multiple meanings, all centering around this idea of the veil. However, what we're going to be talking about primarily are the first two or three, those which are the actual physical hijab, and then the rules that go along with standards of modesty and clothing for men and women in Islam. So what does the Quran say about this? The Quran does not say all that much about dress codes. We might think that there's a lot in there, but there's actually very little. And in fact, the one place where we get the most direct advice on this comes from this text here. In the Quran says, "And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their private parts, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their himar over their breasts and not display their beauty except to their husband, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers or their brothers' sons or their sisters' sons, or their women, or the slaves whom their right hands possess, or male servants free of physical needs, or small children who have no sense of the shame of sex, and that they should not strike their feet in order to draw attention to their hidden ornaments." So that's a lot of the direction that we get from the Quran. In fact, when you look at what the Quran says, it seems to be largely limited to women covering their upper torso and not showing their bosoms. And so that's pretty much most of the advice that you get from the Quran. Now, moving on from there to the Hadith. And you remember that the Hadith, from an earlier slide that you've seen, the Hadith is the oral tradition of the actions and the words of the Prophet that are not recorded in the Quran. And the Hadith also provides some additional information and suggests that a woman's head and possibly her face should be covered. So in the Hadith, which is authoritative, not quite as authoritative typically as the Quran, you do have some extensions of the expectations of a woman covering herself. Also, it's worth noting a couple things. One is that girls are not required to wear the hijab. So up to the age of menstruation, they are not required. After that is when they are required to cover themselves. The other thing is that a lot of people don't realize that these expectations for modesty apply to men as well. Men should also dress modestly, and they can't wear shorts shorter than their knees. And so they shouldn't show an awful lot. And I've seen a lot of Muslim men who tend to dress very conservatively in terms of covering the body. Of course, that doesn't stand out in our culture. If a man is wearing long pants and long sleeves, we don't really even notice that or think about it very much. But there is a standard for that for men as well as women. In fact, there's a story that I heard from Dave Ramsaran. Dave Ramsaran is currently our August Provost here at Susquehanna University. And he told me a story about when he first came to the United States and was studying at American University, and he had a friend who I think was from Morocco, a Muslim friend who had also just arrived. So they were new to the United States. And they went to the gym and worked out, you know, and then afterwards they had to get ready for class. So Dr. Ramzaran's Muslim friend came over to his place to get changed before going to class, and he went to use the shower there on the floor of the dormitory. And shortly after he left, he came rushing back in, talking about how everyone was crazy and there was craziness going on, and he was freaking out. And it turned out that he had gone to the dormitory bathroom and found a communal shower and a bunch of guys in there naked together in a communal shower, which in American society isn't really a big deal, but for Muslim men, even though it's all men, that's a no-no. That's a clear violation of the modesty that one should have with regard to one's body. So it is important to remember that these standards do apply to men and not just to women. Okay, so where are we today? Today, there's a lot of disagreement in the Muslim world. Remember, we're talking about close to 1.8 billion people in many different countries. And so there's a lot of different beliefs and standards and expectations about how men and women will cover themselves. Among the traditionalists today would say that for a woman, everything but her hands and her feet and possibly her face should be covered. And so that's the sort of more traditional view, which does involve a lot of covering for women, and in certain hot countries is got to be unpleasant at times. But that's the traditional notion, which also then means that while her body is covered, the clothes themselves should not be form-fitting. So they should be loose enough not to show a woman's figure underneath. There are others today in Islam who have what we might call a more progressive approach to this. And so their focus on modesty is going to maybe be more limited to a woman covering her hair and her bosom. And then there are some Muslim women who would say, not only Muslim women, but Muslim men and women who would say that the standard on modesty is relative to the culture in which it exists. And so there are different cultures from around the world over many centuries, and they have different notions of what modesty looks like in each culture. And so the point is modesty, not a specific dress code. So there are some Muslims who would look at it that way. So we end up with different standards, different expectations, and different what we might call outfits. And so if you look here, we can see some different coverings that Muslim women around the world may wear. So we'll start off actually here. I think you can see my cursor, the hijab, right? It says a general term meant to cover or veil, and most commonly refers to a headscarf that covers the hair and neck, but not the face. So here is as a basic hijab, if we're talking about the actual headscarf. All the way on the left, we have the niqab, and the niqab, as you can see, covers all of the woman, may cover her hands and feet. I think there's some variations in that, but for the most part, pretty much all you see is the woman's eyes. The burqa, which we found out a lot about with Afghanistan, goes one step further, and even the woman's eyes can't be seen. There's a mesh over her eyes that allows her to see out, but other people not to see her eyes. And then we have the chador, which is associated with Iran, which covers the whole body, but allows the face to be seen. And then also the dupatta that you have in parts of South Asia. So there are different ideas and different standards of what that should look like. Okay, so I did want to tell one story about this. We're not going to spend a lot of time discussing the hijab, but I want to make a few important points. Many years ago when I lived in Nashville, this was in the late 90s, and one day I went to the bank and was waiting in line. There were a lot of people in line at the bank, standing in that bank serpentine line set off by velvet cords. And so we were there for a while waiting. And as I was waiting there was a woman who came and stood in line behind me, and she really stood out. She was obviously different than other people who were there, and she was wearing the niqab. And so here's a picture of some women in the niqab. All black, all you see were her eyes, and you could see her hands. And the woman who was standing there in line was a striking figure for a couple reasons. One, this was the late 90s. There weren't as many Muslims in the United States. This was not, it's not that it's common now, but it was even less common then. So that was striking in and of itself. And it was Nashville, which is hot, and people are wearing fewer clothes when they're out and about. The other thing is that the woman was just a striking figure. She was probably about 6 feet tall, and just looked like a very tall, strong, imposing woman. And all we could see from her then was her eyes and hands. And she had dark skin. And so we didn't know anything really else about her, but it was rather unusual and a bit striking. And so while we're standing in line there, pretending not to notice, so even though we all noticed, and trying, glancing occasionally, but trying not to be obvious, like, because I don't see religion, but it definitely was noticeable. And then there was another lady in line. This was a Southern lady with big blonde hair, probably about 40 years old, bright red fingernails, dressed very well, a certain type of Southern lady. And so while we were waiting in line, this Southern lady turned to the Muslim woman and said, "Honey, you don't have to wear that in America. We're free here." And everyone just stood really still and was really surprised and was wondering what the response is going to be, because we didn't even know if the Muslim woman could speak English. We figured she might be an immigrant. And the Muslim woman then responded with an American accent, and said to the Southern lady in a very firm but polite tone, she said, "I don't wear this because I have to. I wear this because I choose to." And everyone was, we were all, taken aback and listening. And then I started a slow chant of fight, 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 fight. No, okay, that part isn't true. But it was a rather striking and an unusual experience for all of us there. And it underscores a very important point, that when we talk about Islam and Islam's expectations for women and the hijab, whether it be specifically the hijab or any sort of coverings, we have, there can tend to be a notion that Muslim women are victims. They're victims of the patriarchy that tells them you need to wear these clothes and cover yourself. And so on the one hand, we can tend to look at Islam that way. And I think that while there is a point to be made, and certainly in certain places, when you looked at Afghanistan under the Taliban, where women were required to wear the burqa or they could be beaten in the streets, clearly sometimes you do have examples of this being a rather oppressive practice when women are mandated to do this. On the other side, it's important to realize that, like this woman down in Nashville, there are Muslim women who will say, "No, I don't do this because I have to. I do this because I choose to." And this is a decision that I make. This is a decision that I think is good, and I'm going to observe this practice. And in a sense, there can be power associated with this. For a woman to cover in this way, in the United States or in other countries, not where it's mandated, but where she chooses to, it gives her a type of power, a type of moral authority, that when she's living according to this standard, it says she's communicating to people around her, my religion is very important to me, and I'm living by a very high standard of what I think is appropriate. I think it might sort of be like for Catholics. You can have a group of Catholics, and if a nun walks up and she's wearing a habit, she automatically has a certain moral authority, and people are going to listen to her. And so I think there's something comparable, perhaps, with Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab or the niqab or whatever it is that they might choose to wear. So on the one hand, we have women are victims. On the other hand, we have women claiming power. And then it's more complicated than that, because we also have to ask ourselves sometimes, for these Muslim women who say, "Oh, I'm doing this because I choose to, that this is a decision that I make." One has to wonder, well, why do you think this is important? Why do you think this is valuable? Maybe you were told from the time that you were a little girl, a good Muslim woman will wear this. And it's up to you, but a good godly woman will choose to do this. And so for you Freudians out there, there's the question of, has this just been drilled into her superego, so that even though she thinks it's her decision and she's making this decision on her own, it's a result of her upbringing, and it's not the autonomous decision that she might imagine that it is. So I leave you with those three considerations when looking at it. It's not simply a matter of those poor oppressed Muslim women, and it's not simply a matter of they're autonomous and can make their decisions for themselves. It's a complicated matter, and it's going to vary from time to time and place to place. That's my wife calling in. I got to figure out how to hang up on her. Well, hold on. Hello, honey. Hey, I'm making a video right now, and I don't know how to pause this, so you're on it right now. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Bye. She's fine. Okay. All right, so the last thing that I want to share with you is a cartoon that some of you may have seen before. It's one of my favorite cartoons. And you see here, I guess a Western woman in a bikini and sunglasses, I guess going to the beach, passing a woman in a niqab. And the Western woman looks at the Muslim woman and thinks, everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. And the Muslim woman in the niqab looks at the woman in the bikini and thinks, nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. I think there's a lot to be said in that little video, or that little cartoon, and I'll leave it up there for you to look at and consider for a moment. But I think that sheds light on the fact that this discussion of Islam and the hijab and men's and women's roles and expectations is often more complicated than the way that we treat that. So that's the end of our lecture for today, and I hope you have a wonderful day or evening or morning, whatever time you're watching this, and be safe. Bye.